Recording. So, hello everyone. Thank you for the patience in trying to get this all to work. My name is Connor Kiampur. I teach Phil 2030 Intro to Ethics at Georgia State University, and I now have a very needy feline meowing in the background, and I apologize for that. I'm also the vice president of the Center for Ethics Student Forum, who, with the help of Andrew I. Cohen, Donna Hardaway, Austin Keefe, Katie Landers, Bridget Burdett, and many other wonderful people at Georgia State helped organize this event. I'll be your virtual master of ceremonies for today's event. Well, today's event is...
Brenda, Mark, are you hearing?
Yes.
Good.
Okay, sorry. Please make sure to keep your mics off. We can hear residual noise. While today's event is open to the public, it is taking place during what is normally class time for my students. So allow me to make some announcements, again, for students that are just coming in. Remember that you have a quiz and a discussion forum post on Dr. Fabre's paper on treason that we went over last class. Both of these assignments are due by 8 p.m. on Friday, January 29th. 8 p.m. is, as always, a hard deadline. And starting next week, we'll be discussing 2 readings a week, so be prepared for that. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Center for Ethics Student Forum and the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. The Center for Ethics Student Forum is a student group that is dedicated to programming that encourages students to reflect about the ethical issues that matter to their lives as students and citizens. We usually host in-person events at GSU and in the community. Membership is free and open to any student in the GSU community. Contact me for further information at ckiampur1@gsu.edu. Our other sponsor is the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, which is proud to host an extensive set of talks for its Spring 2021 series entitled Ethical Dialogues Across the Virtual University, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. The series includes distinguished visitors who lead conversations on topical issues that connect their work to themes of interest to the students and to the wider community. All such events are free and open to the public. See ethics.gsu.edu for further details. We are delighted to begin this series with our first distinguished guest, Dr. Cecile Fabre, who is a professor of philosophy at Oxford University. She has written extensively about distributive justice, the philosophy of democracy, just war theory, and the ethics of foreign policy. The way I teach my ethics class is by having my students read philosophical hot takes and evaluate them on their argumentative merits. Over the course of her career, Dr. Fabre has adroitly defended contentious philosophical conclusions with scholarly rigor, which makes her work both extremely relevant for a class like mine and just generally enjoyable to read. During her presentation, Dr. Fabre will canvass 2 such works and show us how, though different in many ways, they connect. She will discuss the ethics of live organ confiscation and treason. After Dr. Fabre gives a brief 15 to 20-minute presentation about Good Samaritan duties in various contexts, we will open up the floor for discussion. I will give students of my Phil 2030 class some priority to ask questions, but I will be sure to have Dr. Fabre field some audience questions sent with the chat feature on WebEx as well. My students will have the option of unmuting themselves and asking Dr. Fabre about her presentation, but members of the public will have to use the chat room and tell me they would like to. There's some feedback, so please mute your mics. Thank you. So please make use of the chat room. Without further ado, I will microphone Dr. to talk to us about Good Samaritan.
Okay. So we have really bad feedback.
Yeah, can everyone make sure the microphones are muted? I'm gonna mute everyone real quick. And then
mute myself. All right. Okay, that's much better. All right. So thank you very much for having me to give a talk. I've never been to Georgia, And I wish I could have traveled, to be with you in person. Maybe one day, not too distant future, that will be possible. So let me briefly, in about 15 minutes, outline some of the issues I want to cover in those two articles, but also try and draw out some connections as well as differences between those two articles. So, as I'm sure you know by now, a major concern in moral and political philosophy is that of deciding what it is that we owe to one another as a matter of moral duty. Now, in some cases, it's relatively easy to work out what we owe to one another. I should say that here, what I have in mind when I say what we owe to one another, I mean what we owe to those people who need our help. There are other duties we have to others, such as duties not to harm, but what I have in mind are duties to help, which is why I speak of duties of good Samaritanism. So the really, really easy case is the proverbial scenario where a child falls, into a pond. It's a shallow pond, and the child will die unless you, who happen to be on the scene and who is a very good swimmer, goes in to rescue her. Now, most people will argue that you are under a very strong moral obligation to rescue, the child. If you do not rescue the child, for example, because you don't want to be late for a not very important meeting, or because you are worried about damaging your clothes, you would expose yourself to very, very serious moral criticism. In fact, some people will go further and will say that the child has a right against you, that you help her. By extension, many people believe that we owe it to one another as members of a society, or indeed as members of humanity at large, to give one another the resources we need in order to meet our very basic needs. So if I were giving this talk to a mostly European audience, I would say that most people believe that the case of easy rescue of the pond translates into a duty to accept coercive taxation for the purpose of setting up a welfare state. Now, I say for European audience because I realize that this view can be regarded as more controversial in the United States than it is in Europe. That's something that we can discuss later on. But I think that it is fair to say that irrespective of what European, non-European citizenries believe as a matter of public discourse, the majority of moral and political philosophers take the view that a just society is one in which no one is allowed to fall below a certain threshold of material well-being, and in which duties to help are enforced coercively via taxation. Now, I want to look at some unusual cases. On the view that I've just articulated, we owe it to one another to pay, to give money. Quite often, however, what people need is not money, or not just money. They need a part of our body, or they need us to act in certain ways. And so much of the work I've done in the last 15 years or so has tried to explore that view, to explore duties of good Samaritanism in hard or unusual cases. So let me begin then with the case of body parts. The key claim I try to defend in this paper, and believe me, I realize how controversial a claim it is this: if you think that a just society is one which requires the mandatory transfer of money so as to help those in need, then you must accept within limits the mandatory transfer of body parts, both after we are dead, but also, much more controversially, while we are alive. And in effect, while we are alive, I argue in that paper that within limits, and I'll come to that in a second, we are under a duty of justice to give to those who need them renewable body parts, such as blood, bone marrow, and liver cells. Now, this is very controversial, but before I outline why it is very controversial, imagine that you were to say, we are under a duty of justice to, via taxation, give money so that someone who needs a blood transfusion as a matter of life and death can have that transfusion in publicly funded hospitals, for example. In England, we would say via the National Health Service. In the US, in some cases, you would say via programs such as Medicare and Medicaid. But imagine that the one thing that is missing, we have the surgeons, we have the nurses, we have the hospital infrastructure. The one thing that is missing is blood. And I happen to be around, and I happen to be a match for my blood. It would be very easy for me to give my blood. And I said, no, sorry, it's my blood. I mean, I'm happy to pay taxes so that the operation can take place, but I'm not going to give my blood. Now, in the paper, I argue that there is something incoherent about this particular position, that there is an important sense in which bodily parts, such as blood, generally renewable tissues, are relevantly analogous to money. Now, of course, this is very controversial. Our relationship to our body is very different, for most of us, to our relationship to money. And moreover, the view that I define in the paper raises the daunting spectra of forced labor and forced organ donations as they occur in third world countries. We need to be very worried about this. I agree. But I would like to say in response that although it is true that our relationship to our body is very different to our relationship to money, in fact, ought to be very different to our relationship to money, this does not undermine, I believe, the key claim I make in the paper. And that's because we should be very careful not to fetishize our body, and in particular, the renewable bits of our body. I do have a very different relationship to my body as I have to my bank account, but I don't give any particular value to my blood, qua my blood, to my bone marrow, to my liver, and so on and so forth. Moreover, the duty to give, as a matter of justice, those body parts to those who need them as a matter of life and death in particular, is, like all duties to help, subject to a no undue sacrifice proviso. So we can easily accept, or at least I want to accept, that someone, for example, who has a paralyzing phobia about needles should not be expected to give his blood to someone who needed it, as a matter of justice. There is nothing unusual about that claim. We also say of the duty to give money that it is subject to a no undue cost proviso. So I try to show in the paper that our worries about the general principle that a commitment to distributive transfers of money may well go hand in hand with a commitment to, within limits, the distributive transfer of body parts. I try to show that the worries that we have about that should not be overemphasized or can be dealt with. Let me now move on to the second paper, which Connor had you read, the paper on treason. I'll describe the paper a little bit, and then I will try and draw out some connections between them. So the key claim, well, actually I should say first by way of background that the paper on treason is a standalone article, as you know, but it is also a chapter in a book I've almost finished on the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence, which is one of the most fun topics I've ever written on. And so it has that chapter on treason. So the key claim I make there is that people who are in a position to help others at risk of very serious and wrongful harms by passing on to foreign governments crucial information about what their own government is up to are sometimes under a duty to do so. Now, this act of passing information of that kind is regarded as an act of treason, and in most legal systems, it is one of the most serious criminal offences that there are. What I try and argue in the paper, however, is that under some circumstances, it is a moral requirement. And again, the general thought is this: if you really are genuinely committed to the view that, in principle, we are under a duty to help those in need, very serious need of help, then the form of that duty will vary under the circumstances, and in some cases, it will take the form of an act of treason. And again, the duty is subject to a no undue cost proviso, but the proviso qualifies or exempts people of that duty under specific circumstances. It doesn't completely undermine it. Here, the help that is given does not take the form of money. It does not take the form of a part of your body. It takes the form of a use of your body and person in particular ways. Now, again, this is very, very controversial. One reason why this is controversial, I've already alluded to, it's very risky. Traitors are liable in most, if not all, legal systems to very stiff punishment. In fact, in the US, capital punishment when espionage, of which treasonous espionage is an example, is carried out in wartime. And I've tried, to say very briefly, and I do say at a length, in the paper that there is a no undue cost proviso. But the other reason why, the duty to commit treason and even the permission to do so is very controversial is because in the eyes of most people, we owe duties of loyalty to our fellow citizens. Treason is usually committed for the sake of foreigners. And so if we owe very strong duties of loyalty to our fellow citizens, then by committing treason, we wrong our fellow citizens. We fail to abide by the ties of loyalty which we are supposed to respect. My response to this is that loyalty is conditional. We cannot be, it seems to me, under an obligation to be loyal when the enterprise that binds us is clearly wrongful. And the paradigmatic example is the example of an unjust war, a war that's carried out for wrongful purposes, or acts which are very, very, very wrong, even in the context of a generally just war. Now, there is far much more to be said about both papers, and I'm sure that we'll tackle some of the objections and nuances in the Q&A. But what unites, and that would be my final comment, what unites the two papers is an ethics of good Samaritanism. If we accept the duty to be a good Samaritan in the easy cases, then we need to take very, very seriously the possibility that in so doing, we commit ourselves to endorsing that duty in much more controversial, much more difficult cases as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. In giving an awkward virtual round of applause.
That's all right. Thank you very much. Let me grab a notebook. Oh, by the way, I should apologize. So Connor has a cat looking around. I have a dog. In fact, I saw a dog, on one of the videos. That's why. So my dog is a wonderful golden retriever called Charlie. He's fast asleep at my feet. However, those of you who have dogs will know that a dog is likely at any time to spring, into action and bark because there is someone, passing by. So if that happens, I apologize in advance, and I may need to get up to send him out into the garden. So there we are.
Wonderful. We accept pets here. So
that's great. That's brilliant.
We have a question from a former student of mine, wonderful student. She says, thrilled to hear you talk in person. I found both pieces I've read fascinating and wonderful to argue about. I have a major objection for the idea of dispersing organs. I fully agree that blood should be given far more than it is currently, and that obligatory giving makes a ton of sense. But other organs, like liver lobes and kidneys, just seem unreasonable when compared with the idea of easy rescue. There's nothing easy about being a liver donor. It's an invasive surgery. There's always risk for complications in any surgery, then a week-long stay in the hospital, then 6 to 8 weeks recovery. It just isn't the same thing as an easy rescue.
Yeah, so I think it's a wonderful question. So I started working on this, God, I fear to say, I think about 18, 17 years ago. And when I reread the paper this morning, I mean, I hadn't read it in a long time. It's always nerve-wracking, to reread something that you wrote a long time ago. And when I reread it, I realized that if I were to write it again today, I would try to be much more sensitive, to the concerns that you have just raised. And in particular, one of the things I do not say in the paper, and it was wrong of me, I should have said it, is that the argument stands or falls with the robustness of one's healthcare, system. So there are lots of risks, which anyone incurs, when we go to hospital. Risks of, developing infections, risks that the procedure will go wrong, and in many cases, those risks are avoidable. Either are there because of chronic underfunding, of the healthcare system, which is a problem, as a matter of justice, but they are no less real, for the fact that they are unavoidable. For the fact that there are many of them avoidable. And of course, some risks also are unavoidable. There's one set of risks in particular which I should have mentioned more, or taken more seriously. Even if you give one kidney, the fact that you only have one left puts you at serious risk, if you develop, a kidney disease. Does that mean that I abandon everything that I say in the paper? No, it doesn't. In two ways. One of which I'm relatively comfortable with, the other one I'm unsure about, and I'd like to hear more from you. So the one I'm relatively okay with, is this. It may very well be that the duty which I define in the paper is very, very heavily conditioned, by the harms and risks of harms that you've alluded to. But that's not enough to establish that, in turn, the circumstances under which it could be met would never, occur. So I would be content to say that, even if it is very unlikely that we could ever expect people to discharge, that duty, I think it's important enough a philosophical finding, as it were, to say that some important objections to the duty, particularly to do with how we relate to our own body, are not as serious, objections as we might think. And in fact, I find it really interesting that you seemed to have no difficulty with me in the case of blood. I mean, some people think that even in the case of blood, there is no such duty. So I'm glad that there is a point of agreement, between us. I don't want to speak too long because other people are waiting, but the other point I want to say, and I'm more uncertain about this, is that in the course of our everyday life, we routinely impose very serious risks of harms, and it is serious harms, on other people. So I would want to be sure that the risks and harms that we impose on those Good Samaritans are higher than the routine risks that we incur. Suppose you're very ill and you need, paracetamol to relieve your fever. The only way for you to get it is for me to run to the pharmacy, crossing a busy road. That imposes a risk on me, of being run over. I have no difficulty in this case saying that I'm under a very strong duty to you, to do it. And I want to suggest the possibility that, in the case of live body parts, if those risks are roughly similar to those we routinely incur and impose in the course of our everyday lives, then we are under a duty to incur them.
Wonderful. One of the things that I also mentioned to my class is that this paper was like a preliminary paper to the book that you wrote, Whose Body Is It Anyway? And another proposal that you also include there is that not only should live organ confiscation be something that we consider, but also legalizing markets and organs. And so the market solution might take care of a lot of problems that might otherwise not have existed. So
yes, it might. So that's a reason for thinking that if we have a properly regulated market, I mean, there are worries about this, but if we have a properly regulated market, then the duty proposal might become moot. That's entirely conceivable. Although in situations of severe emergency, like war zones, for example, or in the aftermath of a natural disaster, where the need for blood in particular is very high, then the market might not help. You just need people who are there, to be able, to help. So.
Good. Elizabeth, you wanted to ask a question? Go for it.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Good afternoon. Yeah.
Oh,
That's all right.
so, although I agree with your claim that we should help the medically poor when we can, and it causes no harm to our own.
So I find it, Elizabeth, difficult to hear you. So I'm going to mute myself. Hope.
Okay. Is it better? Okay. So, although I agree with your claim that we should help the medically poor when it imposes no threat on our own lives, I believe it assumes a level of privilege that some of us do not have in the United States. I personally grew up with parents who didn't have jobs that gave them health insurance because they were immigrants and they did not speak English. So, how would you address these families who could not afford the time to take time to recover after surgery? For example, my mom cleaned houses when I was growing up, and she didn't have health insurance, and because we couldn't afford it, and it wasn't provided through her job because she worked for herself. So, if she were to, let's say, donate a kidney, if she didn't work, we didn't eat. So how would you address these families who don't have health insurance or who cannot afford health insurance here in the United States?
So I think that's a brilliant point. I would say that in this particular case, for your mother to be expected to give would fall foul of a no undue sacrifice, proviso. What's interesting to your point is that it shows the degree to which the plausibility of the proposal for any given context so heavily depend on what institutions are in place. It's one of the reasons why I did distinguish what I thought were different attitudes in Europe and the US about social justice. I mean, the situation that you describe, for us, in the UK, in France, in Germany, and so on, is beyond comprehension. I mean, I might as well be very blunt. We simply culturally cannot understand it. And again, if I were to write the paper now, I would say more, about that. So thank you.
Great. I think that Emma had her hand up, so go for it, Emma. Emma, you're muted.
I'm always muted. I'm so sorry. I was wondering what your opinion on the duty to rescue is when it comes to the trolley example. I don't know if you've heard of that. I'm sure you have. And the drowning child. For me, I have a hard time understanding how the duty to rescue applies in the trolley example, the way I can understand it applying in the drowning child example, because and I guess that's more like an argument on utilitarianism and an example of that. But in the trolley example, the duty to rescue also requires you actively choosing who dies. And so I feel like it's very different from the drowning child rescue. And I was wondering if you thought that it applied in that case.
Okay, this is good. You're right that the pond case is easy because we only have one person who needs help. So the problem with the trolley is that we the bystanders may have to decide whether to save the life of one or whether to save the life of the five. And whether which decision you come to, as you correctly pointed out, will depend to a large extent on what your views are about the importance of numbers. Now, I don't regard myself as a utilitarian, as a thoroughgoing consequentialist who believes that numbers make all the difference. So, for example, in the fat man, so I mean this is very, very unpolitically correct, but that's how the example was written back in the days. But let's say in the case where the only way to save the 5 is to push someone onto the rail track, as distinct from diverting the rail track onto a side. So in the pushing someone in a case, most people will take the view, and I would agree with this, that it's morally wrong to do that. It's morally wrong to use someone as a means to save 5 people. Some utilitarians will say, well, no, it's the right thing to do, because you get more utility if you sacrifice the one, however you sacrifice him, and save the 5. Now, suppose, I don't know, what do you think about that, please? You muted.
Yes, I think that for me, I actually have a difficult time seeing the difference between pushing someone on the tracks and choosing one person on the tracks. I think in my mind, I see them as actually very similar, like the same thing, except for the fact that you are putting someone in that circumstance, and if they were already on the tracks, you're not putting them in that circumstance. But I think the moment you choose to kill the one person, you might as well be throwing them on the tracks. I also think as far as like duty to rescue goes, it kind of implies that it's at little cost to you, and it is very much a big cost to you to have to make that decision for which one to spare. Like, that is a psychological thing that you will probably be dealing with for the rest of your life. So that's why I fail to see how duty to rescue exactly applies in this case. Like, I think it would be just as understandable if the person froze or if the person ran away. Like, I think those are also empathizable reactions.
Okay, so let me make a couple of points, and then I'll try to comment on what's being said in the chat. So, so you can understand, because I understand rescuing as saving someone from a serious threat of harm. That threat can be the threat of a natural disaster, as well as the threat of a runaway trolley. So, there is a sense in which, the question raised by the trolley problem is a question of rescue, right? So, we have to choose between rescuing the 5, from the threat of hurtling into a wall on the one hand, or rescuing the 1, from the threat of being thrown on the track, or from having the lever, pulled up. So it seems to me that it's entirely fair, appropriate to think about trolley as raising the issue of rescue. The question is, whom should we rescue? Now, there is a further issue here. Suppose you think that, so we know, Ima, that you think that the case of throwing someone and the case of diverting are relevantly analogous. You think that they are as bad or as good as each other. Now, I don't know whether you think that they are bad, but if you think that the train driver should not divert, and that he should not either make someone fall on the track by pulling a trap open so that the fat man will land on the track, then there is a question as to whether or not you, the Good Samaritan, is morally permitted to intervene. So, if you can stop, the train driver from doing either by harming him in a particular way. Suppose, you are a super shooter, and you can, with a rifle, you can send a tranquilizer dart, into him. Are you morally permitted, to do that? And I think I'm inclined to say that if it is wrong of the train driver to do this, diversion or using the person as a means, then it is morally permissible to rescue that one person by harming the train driver, even though 5 people may well die as a result. Now, someone did say, Ella, you say you're looking at it. So when you say, Ella, you're looking at it from a purely utilitarian standpoint, is the you addressed to me?
No, sorry.
No, it's fine. I just want to clarify it. So,
there was an argument in the chat that it's the same thing to push versus to draw the lever, and I was just saying that to say that they're the same, I think really comes from a utilitarian point of view. And the reason the pushing is hard is it's such a visceral, like you're literally pushing them. It's more detached to pull a lever, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to the view that there is a difference between them. That there is a difference between harming someone foreseeably, though without intending that they should be harmed on the one hand, and harming them as a means, to bring about, a good end. So I'm, as it happens in the majority of people, who take the view that the mode of harming, makes a difference, morally speaking. But I think it's important to recognize that a utilitarian, qua utilitarian, is not committed to the view that diversion and using as a means are morally permissible in this case, right? A utilitarian could say, well, no, as a rule, if we were to live in a society in which it's permissible, to act in those ways, then there would be less utility, in the longer run, right?
Great. So we have 3 hands, and then I also have a question about treason if we don't get around to it. So after these next 3, Tweeter, go for it.
Going back to the organ market, you were saying that would like eliminate like people being obligated to give and like make it like valuable for them to give. I see a lot of problems with that because it's already like a black organ market going on, and a lot of people are getting taken advantage of by like being forced into that. And I think if we made it legal, there'd be like people being taken up by the thousands just to like profit from this organ market. And I feel like a better way to do it would be for that person with the specific needed organ to get like a government payout to give their organ. So that specific person and it meets their specific needs, like the mom that worked to feed the family. If she had a specific organ, the government would pay her, and then she wouldn't have to work during her downtime and would still have money left over from giving her organ. I think that's a lot better method. What do you think?
You're muted, Dr. Fabre.
Sorry, it's my turn. Yeah, that's interesting. So before I address your proposal on the market for organs, I mean, in the book, I argue in favor of very, very, very tight regulation of such markets. In particular, to do with what would have to happen in order for people to be said genuinely to consent to selling their organs, what would have to happen around price, the regulation, and so on and so forth. Now, your proposal, is that in effect, someone, who has an organ to give would have to be paid by the state. I mean, in a way, out of collective taxation, would have to be compensated out of collective taxation. For the trouble and so on. So that would help take care of some of the concerns raised by Elizabeth, earlier, in relation to the hypothetical example of her mom. But here is one thing. So your proposal is interesting because it brings into view a confusion that a lot of us are prone to, which is this. So even if you are right, and I think you probably are right that your proposal is somewhere on the right track, that does not undermine the claim that there is a duty to make available. the resource in question. So you could say, well, look, we have to distinguish, and I didn't sufficiently distinguish, the duty to give, which implies giving for free, and the duty to make available, which is compatible with being financially compensated, for making, available. I mean, likewise, in countries in which there is military conscription, conscripts get a stipend, for the duration of their service in the army. But, they are conscripts. They have, to give time, to the army. So that would be my response.
May I offer a little bit of pushback against maybe thinking that his proposal is on the right track? So the way that I understand the argument, there are kind of two strands of thought that we have, that all of the reasons that we have to jump in and save the drowning child are likewise reasons that we have to think that we are under a duty to provide non-vital organs to the medically poor. So that's like one strand of the argument. And the other strand is that the reasons that we have to redistribute material income are likewise the reasons that we have to redistribute non-vital organs to the medically poor. On the second line of reasoning, if we were to be consistent, it would seem as though the analogy to the proposal that he made with respect to live organs would be that for taxation, when I give money for taxes, that the government should then give me money for paying taxes, which that doesn't strike me as plausible. So I wonder how you might make those two things work.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good. So that's excellent. So the claim that the reasons which many of us have for endorsing coercive taxation are also reasons for endorsing a duty to make available is, I think, compatible with the view that the two cases of money and body parts or services are not analogous in every single respect. There are differences between them, which you've highlighted, and which I've tried to describe in response to Twitter, which may well justify, compensating, people for the body part or the service that they are otherwise under a duty to give, at the bar of justice. Your point is interesting because it highlights, the limits of reasoning by analogy. Quite often, the cases are not the same, and we have to discover whether or not the differences are morally salient, in a way that completely undermines the argument. And I don't think that they are in this case. They push us to think a bit more carefully about what the duty to give it would look like. So for example, as suggested by Twitter, in the cases I have in mind.
Great. Malaika, go for it.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I just wanted to know how you would feel about giving organs to prisoners or criminals versus ordinary citizens, because I feel like a lot of people would love to give their blood to almost anyone, but giving organs to prisoners or to murderers who would kill other people and then giving it back to them, it's like, I kind of feel like there would be a lot of like trauma or even, I guess, psychological damage to the organ givers, that the thought of their organs going to murderers or killers or rapists. And I just wanted to know how you would handle that.
Yeah, again, that's another very, very good question. So I agree with your description of how people feel. I think, however, that the only criterion for distribution is medical need. The only legitimate criterion is medical need. So to say that, someone who, in your example, ex-hypothesizine has already been punished. Ex-hypothesizine, let's assume, has been given, the punishment that she deserves, or that's more legitimate, should be further deprived, of a life-saving resource, is morally problematic. I mean, either they have already been punished as they deserve, in which case, by implication, to deny them that resource is tantamount to adding to their punishment, so to punishing them out of proportion to what they deserve, or they have been given less than the punishment that they deserve. But then the worry about taking away from them the possibility of a life-saving resource is that it is tantamount to imposing on them a further punishment by extrajudicial mechanisms. So that's my serious worry about this this kind of proposal. But I know that in many circles it's a very controversial thing to say, what I've just said.
And I just wanted to add one more thing. So, for the people who are intentionally damaging their own organs, would it be permissible to continue just enabling their behavior of damaging their organs?
Yeah, that's good. So actually, again, another very, very good question. So as a matter of fact, as I understand medical practices around allocation of medical resources in general, and particularly with respect to organs, the prospect of success, so whether the transplant will take, for example, is factored into the decision to transplant or not. And if continuing self-harming behavior, on the part of the putative patient, leads us to think that the transplant will not be successful, then that would be a reason for not giving them the resource. Now, there is a deeper concern, I suspect, at the heart of your question, namely whether or not the fact that someone is responsible for their predicament weakens their claim to receive help. And the issue arises with transfers of money in general. So, in the 19th century, the thought was couched as a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. So the deserving poor were those who had got into poverty by misfortune, they deserved help. The undeserving poor were feckless, irresponsible, and so on and so forth, so it was argued, and did not deserve help. I'm often skeptical of attributions of responsibility, partly because I fear that they tend to underplay the very deep structural mechanism which make it very difficult for people fully to be regarded as responsible for their predicament. The limit cases, the cases where I would be inclined to say tough, we can't help you, are cases of people, for example, who go skiing off-piste, knowing full well that they risk being caught in an avalanche, and where we have to decide between helping them, on the one hand, and helping someone, who is similarly needy, but not by dint of reckless behavior. Then I'd be tempted to say, well, in that case, given that we have to make a choice, we may, in fact, ought to help, the unlucky, rather than the person who's responsible. But it seems to me that there are very few cases of that kind. So.
Great. So one more question. Ella, does your question have to do with organs? Okay, go for it. And then I'll ask a question about treason and see if we can shift the conversation a little bit.
It's a two-part question. I'm sorry. First part is I think it would be exploitative to have a system because you're always going to find people who either manage to get themselves on the list in order to make ends meet or to make more money or whatever it happens to be, and then people who want to get out of it as well. And I think you'd end up with more of a black market, and not a black market, but like a messed up kind of system perhaps in that. And my second comment is, do you think that maybe a happy medium between what is, I think we can all agree, a very controversial stance versus what we have now is making organ donation a default, for example, like when you go sign up for a driver's license, like I think it should be a default category that you have to opt out of actively. Yeah, because I think that would solve a lot of problems too.
So I'm with you that exploitation is a very, very serious worry. One of my difficulties with the current system is that, take a kidney transplant operation. The only important actor is not the patient in that operation, who does not get paid in most countries, is the kidney donor. The surgeons are paid, the nurses are paid, the cleaners, who make sure that the surgical theatre is sterilized and so on, are all paid. The kidney donor is not. And I do have worries, about that. So I would hope that a properly regulated, organ market, which again, would be very careful about things, like consent, prices that have got to be, offered, etc., so as to reduce bargaining inequalities, might work. But I also agree that the preferred option should be an opt-out system. I completely agree with you there.
Wonderful. So in class on Monday, one of my students, Virginia, if she's here, asked a really great question that for the paper that you wrote about treason, it's not something that you necessarily needed to talk about for the piece, but it was something students were curious about. So you go to great lengths for about a third of the piece to show us that treason is presumptively wrong and that we should think of it as wrong until there are reasons to think that it's permissible or required, provided that it's presumptively wrong. And I assume that you're not like a punishment abolitionist. What would be the appropriate punishment for somebody who commits treason, given that it was a wrong kind of treason rather than a permissible or required kind of treason?
Yeah, good. So hang on, just because, so we're looking at cases where the agent ought not to have committed treason. So it's a wrongdoing. And the question is, what kind of punishment is warranted? I take that to be your question. Now, you're right, I don't talk about this in the book or in the paper because the work is not about punishment. A couple of points. I mean, first of all, not every wrongful, so and I have to think on my feet here because I haven't thought about that question, before. But let me simply say first that not every wrongdoing that we commit warrants a criminal, response. So, for example, I say in the paper that one of the cases in which the traitor ought not, to commit treason, is one in which if she were to commit treason, she would expose, her close, family to really, really serious risks of harm. I mean, in fact, in the Soviet Union, you could expose your spouse, your children to being dead, not just to being killed, sorry. So there, treason is wrong as a wrongdoing to one's children. It's not clear to me that as this particular wrong, it is a criminal offense. So that's the first point to make. So now we are looking at cases where, treason is a wrong done to the community at large. It is an act committed, for example, in the service of grievously unjust ends. I do believe that the people who betrayed, Britain and the United States and France, for the benefit of the USSR during the Cold War, two of whom are Americans who are still alive. They're very well known. Aldrich Ames on the one hand and Robert Hansen on the other hand. They committed that kind of wrong. Now, you're asking me about what my theory of punishment is. So let me now say a couple of things about that. In the chat earlier, someone in connection with organs asked, well, do we all have a right to life? And then someone else, I think, said, well, what about the death penalty? Well, I'm against the death penalty in all circumstances for various reasons. And so I believe that imposing the death penalty for the crime of treason when it is a crime, is unjust, not because of the nature of the crime, treason, but because, in my view, the death penalty is unjust under any circumstances. And I would say the same about a lifetime in solitary confinement, without possibility of parole. Again, what makes it wrong is the punishment itself. It's not the fact that it is, a punishment for treason. Apart from that, I do not know. I don't have a scale, of proportionate punishment on which I could affix, treason, relative to theft, or murder. The final thing I want to say in response to, again, thinking on my feet in response to this question is that any account of what would be a legitimate punishment for treason would have to be sensitive to what the act specifically is. So if what you've done is junior, a bit silly civil servant, and you gossip after work at the bar with someone who turns out to be, an agent from the Chinese embassy, and you disclose, state secrets, you sort of know you shouldn't do it, but you do it anyway because you've had too much to drink. You could say that this is an act of treason that ought to be criminalized, but it's not the same, it seems to me, as passing on the entire blueprints, of your country's nuclear arsenal, to a rival, foreign power. The latter should, I think, be punished more harshly, than the former. So I don't know whether that helps, go some way towards answering the question, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Aman, you have a question, go for it.
Hey, I had a two-part question, but more so, I kind of bounces in between the two works that we read of yours, the
Yeah.
Life of Organ Confiscation and Treason. And the first one was the first time we read Life of Organ Confiscation. We were having a discussion in class, and I was really against it. Like I was super against it. Just like you said, maybe if you had wrote it in a more emotional way, maybe I don't know, if you butter it up. But it was very hard to take, right? As a human, it was very hard to be like, okay. And then we had to read it for exercise writings or whatnot. And then I read it again, properly, and then you made points which it would be ignorant of me to disagree because I actually do agree with those. And one thing that you made was a realization that we should not be too attached to our bodies. As how we're attached. Like that's why I had that response. It's like you're telling me to give up something that's just like you said. Some people had drawn this line or this bubble into people on people's bodies, saying that should not be such things that we should touch as in taxes and stuff. But then you made points where you're like our organs are can also be considered if we have multiple of them and if we still can lead a decent life, then they can also be considered resources in a sense. And I found that to be a very super organism idea, right? Like you're looking at things on a bigger scale in a sense, right? Ed Wilson talks about how from individual point of view, he looks at ants and how they operate as an organism, and then for the greater good, right? Like for the species in a sense. I mean, whether that's the reason or not, whether that's instinct or not, I don't know. But I was gonna ask you. My first question was like, how did you get to that point? Maybe like culturally it's different in Europe and stuff. And I mean, even though I'm in America, like I'm originally from Ethiopia, and even the view there is a lot more culture heavy and stuff. So there's a lot of. I mean, it took me a lot, and I was wondering what made you realize oh, our organs are also can be resources in a sense of it's how did you stumble upon that emotion or
Yeah, that's an interesting. I don't often get asked, and I think we don't ask enough of one another. What's the journey that led you there? So I'm really glad that you asked. So I do not remember a time. I genuinely cannot remember a time where I didn't think that the default position was mandatory taking of organs after death. I mean, I remember, reading stories when I was a teenager about people dying while waiting on organ transplant lists, because not enough people, were willing, to donate. So, you know, in the very first book I wrote, I made an argument for the duty to give money. And then there came a point, once I had finished that book, you know, in the late 90s, where I said, well, hold on a sec. First, you think that there is a duty to give money. Second, you think that there is a duty to give organs after death. Can you try to make a philosophical argument for the duty to give organs after death, you know, along similar lines as the duty to give money? And so I did that in a paper. But then, of course, the natural question was, well, what about when you're alive, right? So if this is what you think after death, well, you have to think about cases, you know, when you are, you know, alive. So that's how, you know, I got to that point. A lot of my work, I do it this way, and I don't know, this might be a suggestion, you know, for you. It's like, you know, thinking about the sort of next case. So actually, I'll give you another example, and I'll shut up because I'm sure there might be other people. But so, okay, so you think about money, fine, we've done money. Organs, yeah, okay, I think I have something to say about organs. What's the next case? Well, then I thought, hold on, sometimes the service, we don't need a body part. We don't merely need a service. We need a very, very particular kind of service. We need a service that takes the form of an act of killing. So is there a duty to kill, you know, in defense of others? So I wrote a paper about that. And that led me to spending 10 years thinking about the ethics of war. So it just shows, you know, how, you know, you can pull, you know, the strands one after the other and, you know, go more and more deeply and widely into the issues. Does that help, you know, answer your question?
Yeah. My second part of the question was just in contrast to having read Libels and Confiscation, and then someone reading the treason paper that you wrote. I kind of see a duality in it, both. I mean, earlier you drew the comparison, but my first instinct or my first thing was like, oh, this is kind of contradictory in a sense, maybe, because the way I interpreted it was, you know, libel confiscation is um, a very uniting idea, right? It's for humans, it's very uniting. It's very integrated, like see each other, donate, and kind of just like I said, a superorganism idea, right? Like looking at humans from a superorganism point of view. And then treason, I found, you know, my first instinct was like I read the paper on treason, like for treason to be committed, there needs to be two different parties, right? Like two different parties, and more so countries. And you know, I think if we all did some research on, you know, whether countries like patriotism, being patriotic and stuff, it's you know, it's debatable, right? Like whether we should fight. Like you said, you did studied about war and stuff, and probably could see that that's sometimes it's unnecessary, right? Like there's a lot of lost causes because of people's egos. You know, for example, in the third world countries, it's usually the wars or whatever that arrest the people. It's just because a few individuals are on the top and they want to, you know, spread their selfish views or they want to get all the resources, so therefore they spread propaganda. There's all this stuff, right? So for treason, I just kind of found it. I might have been misinterpreting it, so I don't, you know, no offense in any case, but I just found it a very contradictory because I read the paper on live organ confiscation, which is a very uniting idea, and then treason, even though you're using treason to, you know, say for the greater good to unite, I can see that point as well, but for treason to be committed, you know, I just want to see your views on war and actual treason and the differences between two countries, and what your belief is on those things.
So first of all, I don't get offended very easily, so you shouldn't, you know, be worried.
All right, I'll take it back, I guess.
It's fine. But I think you've put something, you've put your finger on, you know, a difference between the two strands of the work, which I haven't quite thought of in this way. So I'll try and articulate it. I think you've raised something very interesting. So, you know, in the live, you know, paper, the organ paper, but generally in the work where I argue in favor of a duty to rescue by way of transfers of money or services, organs, and so on, the duty takes the form really mostly of doing something for someone else, okay? A fellow human being, for example. But in the treason case, the difference, and in other similar, cases, the duty to kill, being another one, these are cases where the only way to help another person will be by harming, a third party, or by, breaching a bond, that we have, with our fellow citizens, etc., etc. So your question is interesting because, again, going back to the extent to which analogical reasoning can work, that you might argue is a profound, difference, between those two sets, of cases. I don't know whether this is something like that, that you had in mind, but that at any rate is what your question, got me, to think about. I'm not quite sure what to add, to what I just said. Well, actually, I will add one thing. In my work on war, so I wrote a book on war. I wrote a book on peace after war. I wrote a book on action which falls short of war, like economic sanctions. For all that, these issues arise, morally speaking, because in order to help, we have to harm, someone else. What unites these different books, is the thought that our duty to help, we have it irrespective of borders. So that's why I call the view cosmopolitan view, right? So what I want to say, in treason cases, for example, is something like, a French, military officer does not have a special duty to French people, which takes precedence, a duty not to harm, French, people, which takes precedence over a duty he has to someone from Ethiopia to help, that person. So there is a sense in which, universalism, which you correctly detected, in the work on the body, is a fundamental principle, in the work on the body. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm not quite sure what else I can add, to that.
That's wonderful. And we're already over time, but provided that the last 3 questions are short, would you be willing to answer them? Okay.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you. Savannah, take it away.
Right. Well, first and foremost, thank you for being here with us. Second, I personally, your papers are very controversial, but I personally agree with a lot of your views and points. And I understand a lot of what you are saying. I can understand the flaws and what people are bringing up against it, but I feel like you do a great job explaining your side and defending yourself. And then with that being said, with reading both of the papers and hearing your views, do you believe that there could one day be a world where that follows universal human rights and duties?
No, but that's because I'm a pessimist, by temperament. So I mean, your question is in a way emotionally difficult because it goes to the heart of what we, and when I say we, I don't just mean me, I mean all of us, you as well, what we want to achieve, as moral and political philosophers. So if you are a moral political philosopher who is also a pessimist, you have a really hard time because you have to live, with the fact that however hard you work at trying, to define your views, you believe, and you have to hope that you are wrong, but you believe that they will not come to fruition. So no, I mean, I think, some progress, has been made, but here's an example, again, going back, to the point that was made a moment ago about, acting, for the sake of all our fellow human beings. I mean, if you look at what's happening at the moment around COVID, where you have, pronouncements against so-called vaccine nationalism, that I and others have written against, vaccine nationalism. The World Health Organization has cautioned against it. Do governments listen? No, they don't. And that's partly because they believe, and I think in some cases rightly, that their citizens will not be willing to listen. So sorry, that's a long way of saying unfortunately no.
Nur, go for it.
Okay, so I haven't been here for that long, so if this has already been brought up, I apologize. But there was like an argument in chat about whether we would give organs to prisoners, and I was wondering if your view encapsulates rehabilitative justice as opposed to like punitive justice or other kinds of criminal justice systems.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I tried to phrase my response. So my response was that the fact that you have committed a criminal offense does not disqualify you, from receiving organs, even though organs are scarce. And I tried to phrase my response in such a way as to be agnostic on the underlying theory of punishment. So you can be a retributivist and agree with me, by deploying a particular conception of desert. If you're a rehabilitativist, then you will agree with me, as well. If you're a deterrence theory, a proponent of deterrence theories of punishment, you can also agree, with my position. And likewise, if you are an expressivist. So I think that the position I defended is neutral, as between those different views, of punishment.
And the last student question goes to Ella Thompson.
I don't know that this is an amazing last question. I had started to think about the idea of arbitrary categories earlier, and this idea a little bit kind of about the fetishization of like our bodies as kind of like arbitrary, but then with your treason argument, a lot of it is based on the idea that you betray the people around you and your nation. And I think it's, I don't know if it's exactly a question, but it's kind of arbitrary. Like the fact that we assign, I mean, I guess for people who have been like conscripted into like national service, like the CIA or whatever, but like for your average person, do you, and I know you talk about this, but I haven't had a ton of time to process your paper, but is this idea of arbitrary categories something that you thought about in the context of your treason paper? Does that make, I'm not sure that question made sense.
No, it does. So, no, I think that's good. And it does make sense, at least if I've understood correctly, which I may not. So you have to correct me if I've been wrong. But so remember I said earlier, in response to Emmanuel's question that, one of the guiding, in fact, possibly the guiding, principle that runs through and underpins my work on war, foreign policy, and indeed espionage is the cosmopolitan principle. And that principle says that actually there is a fundamental respect in which national stroke political borders are morally irrelevant. So, I really believe that, the fact that I'm French, that you are American, that Emmanuel is Ethiopian, really ought to make no difference, morally speaking, as to whether or not I live or die. Whether or not my basic needs and your basic needs and Emmanuel's basic needs, are met. So, one implication of that view is that there is far less fundamental moral value to the relationships that we have, with our fellow citizens. And so feelings of loyalty towards our fellow citizens ought to play much, 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 much less role in ordinary morality as than they are thought by many to play. So did I understand rightly what you were trying to say?
Yes, and I guess the thing that had brought this up for me most of all was the idea of like and I lean quite utilitarian. Not fully, but enough. The idea of like you are a spy or whatever in order to stave off world war or nuclear disaster or genocide or whatever, and just this idea that you do transcend this arbitrary category to benefit mankind in general. And it sounds like maybe not for the same reasons, but you are in line with that. But yes, that was exactly where I was trying to go. I just didn't phrase it.
No, so I don't have to stop, but can I give a final
Yes.
example to illustrate that? So, you know, I said earlier that I took a very dim view of, you know, people who spied for the Soviets, you know, during, you know, the Cold War. And I take a dim view of most of them. But there is one individual, Klaus Fuchs. He was a scientist who arrived in Britain just before the Second World War from Germany. He was a physicist. He worked on the Manhattan project in the US, so the nuclear bomb project during the war. And he passed on atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, it's true, he was a communist by ideology, but he was not committed to the Soviet Union as the institutional instantiation of communism. As far as we know, the reason he passed on the secrets is because he thought that world peace was dependent on there not being only one nuclear superpower. That world peace was dependent on nuclear deterrence. And I think that's an interesting argument. So I'm much more sympathetic to this universalistic, stand on what it takes, to bring about world peace, than I am, of the likes of Ulrich Ames, for example. He is one of the two who's still alive, who spied. He was a CIA, high-ranking officer. He spied for the Soviets. He's serving a life sentence somewhere in Indiana. I think his motivation was money, by and large. So I have no track with that. So I mean, I think you put your finger on something that's very important with that. So.
Well, this was so wonderful, and what a privilege it is for me to be an instructor of record and to have the excuse to reach out to one of my favorite philosophers and get her to talk to my students. Thank you. Everyone give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Cecile Fabre. It's been so nice to have you and have you at some point.
Can I just say, it's been a lot of fun. Really, I've really enjoyed it. Your questions were really wonderful, and they forced me, to think harder, about all of this. So thank you very much, for having me. It was a really genuine, pleasure. And so all I can do is wish all of you the very best of luck. Not just with your academic studies, but with your study of philosophy in particular, and much more importantly, for the rest of your lives, both, professionally, personally, and familially. These are really difficult circumstances for all of us, particularly for students, I think. And so I really hope that it goes well, for all of you. So, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to stop recording and